In this video, I'm going to introduce the concept of value at risk. So we're going to discuss market risk, and this is a challenging concept to wrap one's head around. And so first we need to talk about what we're trying to measure. So one typical question we might ask ourselves is how much money can we lose given some portfolio invested in the market? Unfortunately, the answer to that question is actually fairly easy to give. If we're asking truly how much money can we lose, then we can almost always concoct a scenario in which we lose our entire investment. For example, if we invest $100,000 into an S&P 500 index tracking ETF, tomorrow, in theory, the S&P 500 can open at zero and wipe out our investment. Alternatively, we could buy $100,000 of a 4-week U.S. Treasury bill, and tomorrow we could wake up and the U.S. government has defaulted on its debt and we've lost all our money. We can concoct scenarios like this pretty much for any investment. So if we simply look at risk in terms of how much money could we possibly lose, it doesn't matter what we invest in. The answer is almost always everything. So one solution to that is to look at some tolerance and time horizon. And this is where value at risk comes in. So value at risk is an estimate of the potential loss in value due to adverse market movements. It's often based, it doesn't have to be, but it's often based on historical analysis of the changes in asset or portfolio values. It is typically specified by two parameters, a time horizon and a frequency or probability of occurrence. So banks typically use a one-day 95th percentile value at risk as an estimate of the potential losses in value of trades. So the time horizon for a bank is 1 day, but sometimes it could be 2 weeks or 1 week or 5 days or a year. We can choose our time horizon, which is relevant. So let's talk about a 1 day. So 1 day, 95th percentile value at risk. This is a number. It's a loss number. So a 1 day, 95th percentile value at risk of $1 million means that 95% of the time, this portfolio loses less than $1 million. The profit and loss on this portfolio is less than $1 million. Could be positive, could be negative, but less than $1 million. 5% of the time, we lose more than $1 million. We could change that time horizon. Instead of 1 day, we could use a week, 5 days or 7 days, 5 business days, for example. And we would expect that the 5-day 95th percentile VaR will be larger than the 1 day 95th percentile VaR. Now, we have two parameters to choose from. Banks typically use this 1 day 95th percentile value at risk for a few reasons. One, our regulators like that. Two, we typically within a bank's trading portfolio think that the traders in the bank are going to do things every day, so it's unlikely you're going to hold a position for longer than a day. So worrying about a 10-day loss is not a realistic thing to worry about because by the time 10 days happens, your position's changed. Second, 95th percentile is a nice number because that means 5% of the time the loss is bigger than this number, 1 in 20 days. That actually happens often. And so we can test whether our number makes sense. Is it too aggressive? Is it too conservative? And so we can think about, does the number make sense relative to the profit and loss we make in our portfolio? So it's useful for a whole series of reasons. One, we can do trend analysis and product comparisons. Right? A value at risk is an objective measure. We can decide, is it correct or is it not correct? We can aggregate across portfolios and products. If I know the delta on a position and the vega on a position, I don't know how to add those up and decide how much risk I have. Value at risk allows me to do that. I can backtest, as I said, against my profit and loss. Regulators in the industry like this measure. So for example, banking regulators may ask the bank to tell them what the 1 day 95th percentile value at risk is. and they can look at different banks and have some confidence this is an objective measure of how much risk the bank is taking. The bank with a large value at risk number is a riskier bank than a bank with a small value at risk number. Some of the drawbacks would be that one often uses historical data to infer what the market might do in the future, and that is often a fraught exercise. This does not account for the relative liquidity of assets, and it assumes normality. It doesn't capture tail events perfectly well. If we have a value at risk number, a one-day 95th percent value at risk number of $1 million, that means 5% of the time, 5% of the days, we will lose more than $1 million. What it doesn't tell us is how much more, right? We could lose 10 or 12 or 15 or $25 million. And the $1 million could be an accurate representation. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the tail. So it's not a perfect measure, but it's a useful measure for thinking about risk. Now, pictorially, we choose a percentile, 95th percentile, 99th percentile, whatever it happens to be, and value at risk is this edge of the distribution. 5% of the losses are bigger than this number. So we use value at risk in all sorts of ways, but we have to make decisions about these parameters. For example, as I said before, if my holding period for my position is on the order of a day, then a one-day number makes sense. If my holding position is more like 2 weeks, then a 10 business day value at risk would make more sense. If I'm very conservative, a 99th percentile value at risk might be the right number to think about my portfolio. If I'm less conservative, 95th or 90th percentile value at risk. We can tweak this concept to think about, to tailor to our personal risk preferences.